Hello everyone, today's video is all about claiming travel, accommodation and subsistence expenses for those who are self-employed. An interesting court case recently heard in the UK first tier tribunal was a Mr. Taylor who lived in Scotland, but he was based for work in Swindon, and he chose to work down there. He had a lot of contacts down there and had multiple sites within Swindon that he worked as a subcontractor in the building trade. Now, he claimed in his tax return deductions for travelling from his home in Scotland to Swindon, and also for accommodation while he was in Swindon. HMRC raised an assessment on his tax return. They opened an inquiry and they said that basically those expenses for travel were not wholly and exclusively for the purpose of his trade. So to get a tax deduction, an expense has to be wholly and exclusively for the purpose of the business. They're the key words. Basically, HMRC said, look, this guy, he trades from Swindon. Swindon is his base, not Scotland, where he lives. So they also said that he didn't take reasonable care when preparing his tax return, and it was an error that he was alerted to himself from HMRC, so they hit him with an 18% penalty. So HMRC actually said, look, if Scotland was his base of operations, one-off contracts to Swindon would have been treated as allowable. However, this whole idea of having multiple contracts within the area wasn't just a one-off. They said, look, that switches the base of operations. So the base is Swindon, therefore you cannot claim for the travel between Scotland, where he lived, to Swindon. So what did the court say? So the first tier tribunal, they said that basically, yes, whilst an expense may be necessary for an individual to do their work, nevertheless, it has to still meet the wholly and exclusively criteria. And they said that Mr. Taylor had chosen to work in Swindon when he could have chose to work anywhere in the UK. Certainly he could have chosen to stay to work closer to home. So for some reason, out of convenience, he chose to work in Swindon. So his base of operation was Swindon, not his home in Scotland. So they denied him the travel expenses going down from Scotland to Swindon every week. However, on the one good bit of good news for the taxpayer on this is because Mr. Taylor sought professional help and was cooperative with HMRC in dealing with the inquiry into his tax return, that his penalty was reduced to 0%. So it did result in him paying extra tax because the tax relief on the travel expenses were denied, but his penalties for getting it wrong in the first place were reduced to nil. So it's a difficult area of the tax law, is the wholly and exclusively and accommodation and travel. It's very subjective, and each case turns on the facts. So it usually depends on what is deemed to be, or where is deemed to be the base. Where is the base of operations, which is often tricky to decide because it's not always the home in the absence of a traditional office. So in this case, he was denied tax relief for the travel expenses, but was allowed tax relief on the accommodation. Now, contrast this with another case. This is the case of Tim Healy, the famous actor from Auf Wiedersehen Pet. Now, he was starring about a decade or so ago in the West End production of Billy Elliot. And at the time, he lived in Cheshire. He used to come down every week and stay in a flat that he rented in London. And he claimed the accommodation costs and travel to the theatre and subsistence. Now, basically what happened was that HMRC again used the argument to say that, look, London was his base for work, for his work as an actor, not his home in Cheshire, and denied the tax relief on the travel costs. They also denied the relief on the subsistence costs because there was no evidence for those. But basically, the HMRC said, look, the accommodation is not wholly and exclusive. So they denied the accommodation costs. It went to the tribunal, and the first tier tribunal actually sided with Tim Healy. They said, look, we don't believe that his base, he has moved to London. We believe that, you know, his home is, his base is in the Northwest, and he can claim for the costs of living in London. HMRC appealed that case. It went to the upper tribunal, who batted it back to the first tier tribunal for a rehearing. And basically, the long and short of it was that Tim Healy was unsuccessful at the subsequent rehearing. Basically, what happened was that an interesting tax facet of this was that Tim Healy admitted that he chose the flat because it was large enough to also entertain people in. That he could have people round to come to this 3-bedroom flat during his run on the stage production. Now, this proved to be fatal to the cause because this introduces another concept in the tax world, that of duality of purpose. So, yes, he needed somewhere to stay, but he didn't need somewhere so big as to have a secondary purpose of entertaining all his showbiz pals. And that was the reason why, in this case, HMRC said you cannot claim the tax deduction for the accommodation because of this so-called duality of purpose, which was evident from the outset. Ironically enough, even though that 3-bedroom flat was cheaper than, say, him living in a hotel, if he'd have incurred an expense living in a hotel room, that would have been allowable. But because this flat had this double purpose of both housing him and so he could have these guests around, that duality was the reason for HMRC to deny the claim. So contrast that with the case of Mr. Taylor, where the accommodation was allowable, but with Tim Healy, the accommodation wasn't allowable. So all of these things turn on their facts. There's no hard and fast rule. But very important for self-employed individuals who do stay away from home quite a lot. Need to think about these things. Interestingly enough, the law actually sets no limit as to how long you can stay away from home to obtain the tax relief. It could be 1 night or it could be 100 nights. It doesn't matter. It's all about where is your base and what is the purpose, what is the type of accommodation. That's what it all boils down to, not so much the actual permanency or the itinerant nature of your staying away from home. So can be quite tricky to analyze and to pinpoint and really advise on in terms of giving a hard and fast rule. Hence, every case turns on its own merits. So if you are a sole trader and you are working away from home a lot, then do consider whether or not you'll be caught by the wholly and exclusively rules, or whether or not there was some other purpose for the particular accommodation and travel that you have, and maybe the tax relief will be denied. So you do need to have a think about that. So that's just an update on travel and accommodation and subsistence costs for sole traders, self-employed people. If you like this video, please subscribe here, and I will see you soon.